So, now we come to the most important lecture in American history. Wait, I hear you, by the way. Yes, you, 3 a.m. The sigh, and you're rolling your eyes because, once again, Mr. Dry is indulging in some needless hyperbole and exaggeration. And you know what? Maybe you're right, but it is the most important lecture in American history because it's a discussion on what leads to the creation of American history. Specifically, the history of the United States of America as an independent country. But it also involves a horrible breakup story. A horrible breakup story between Great Britain and its American colonies. And that breakup was not preordained. There was nothing fated about it. There was nothing that was really all that predictable about it. Even though we've already gone over some of the potential causes of American independence, I've kind of been throwing them in throughout the course. But, once we talked about the French and Indian War and its conclusion, we talked about some potential sources of conflict between Great Britain and its American colonies. And nonetheless, the British Empire, as it existed in 1763, was probably the most powerful empire on earth. At the very least, it was probably the most impressive-looking empire on earth. Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister during World War II, would coin the phrase that the sun never sets on the British Empire. And of course, Churchill was kind of one for some boasting. He wasn't a very humble person. I missed the opportunity to, do my Churchill impression. I'm sorry. But the fact is that Churchill let's say, wasn't just boasting about the size of the British Empire. From Churchill's perspective, he was just pointing out an objective fact that because the British Empire spanned the globe, at any given time, the sun was always shining on some part of the empire. And it has to be said that that was still the case for the British Empire all the way back in the 18th century. We talked about the fact that after the end of the French and Indian War, the British managed to carve out an empire for themselves that was greater in size than the Roman Empire. And unlike the Roman Empire, though, which was based upon military conquest to a certain extent, the British Empire was more based on trade. The British did not have a military state. It was still an empire based upon the ideas of Magna Carta and representative government, even though we've talked about some serious disagreements between the British and their American colonists over the role of judges and juries and civil and natural rights. The fact is that the British Empire wasn't an empire in which the military at times stepped in and controlled things, which was kind of the case for some of the other contemporary European empires. It wasn't really an empire in which power was concentrated in the hands of the monarchy. Instead, it was an empire that had, I don't want to say democratic traditions, right? But at least it had a representative government that went back all the way to King Edward I in the 1200s, actually. And to be honest, the British Empire looked like it was fairly progressive, at least from a political perspective. We've talked in previous lectures about the fact that the English had a civil war in which Parliament successfully overthrew the monarchy for at least a brief period of time. The monarchy comes back, but nothing's quite the same after that. At the very least, Parliament has sort of demonstrated its superiority, its power over the crown. And you probably also remember that in 1689 you have the Glorious Revolution, in which King James II is also deposed by Parliament, admittedly with a little less bloodshed than the English Civil War involved. And so because of that, when you have Enlightenment philosophers like Voltaire talk about the model for good government he looks to the English. Voltaire says, quote, "The English are the only people on earth who have been able to regulate the power of kings by resisting them, and who, by a series of struggles, have at length established that wise form of government where the prince is all powerful to do good, and at the same time is restrained from committing evil, where the nobles are great without insolence and without vassals, and where the people share in the government without confusion." So, if you're Voltaire or any other Enlightenment philosopher, the British aren't some kind of model of taxation without representation or tyrannical government. King George is not a tyrant, nor is he mad. Instead, what you're going to do is you're going to hold Great Britain up as an example of what good government looks like. So when you want to rubbish King Louis XV of France or any of the other overly autocratic monarchies of Europe, what you're going to do is say, well, why can't the French government, the Russian government, whatever, be more like the British model? And also, it has to be said that many of the American colonists kind of felt the same way, a sort of admiration for the British system of government. And you can kind of get a glimpse for this based upon the words of Benjamin Rush. Benjamin Rush, by the way, eventually becomes one of the founders, somebody who's very influential during the Revolutionary War and afterwards. And Benjamin Rush, apparently, like many well-to-do Americans during the 18th century, and of course during the 20th and 21st centuries, decided to take a trip to Europe. And while he was in Europe, he decided to tour the British House of Commons. By the way, the House of Commons is basically the equivalent of the British Capitol building. It's where Parliament meets. And apparently, well, actually, it's not the House of Commons because Benjamin Rush tours the Houses of Parliament in general, but he tours the British House of Lords as well. Now, one of the things that you see in the House of Lords, then and today, is that there's a throne in the middle of the room. And this is where the monarch sits when they're giving the king or queen's speech, which basically inaugurates Parliament for a specific term. And by the way, this is kind of like the British equivalent of the State of the Union address. So here Benjamin Rush is, standing in the nerve center of British politics, the House of Lords. And he has the room all to himself. I mean, there's a tour guide or somebody who's kind of taking him through the House of Lords, but he has this room all to himself. And there's a fancy chair in the middle of the room. And I'll let you guys take a guess as to what he asks next. And if you said that he asked to sit on the throne, you'd be right. Which I feel like should give us a certain sense of kinship with Benjamin Rush, right? Touristy behavior hasn't really changed very much in almost 300 years. So he has to sit in the throne. But, Benjamin Rush isn't just like one of those Visigoths who, vandalizes the places that he visits. He's really taken in by the experience based on what he writes afterwards. So here's how he described the experience of basically walking into the center of the British government. He says, quote, he felt as if he walked on sacred ground with emotions that I cannot describe. He was overcome. This was not just, that dorky little thing that we sometimes do where we take you up to the state capitol or, take you to a tour of Washington, D.C., and you get to see all the government buildings. And yeah, you kind of do it because you have to. And some people actually might get excited about it, but not Rush. Like, for him, this was almost a pilgrimage. This was an emotional experience. An emotional connection to the British government, but also to the throne to the king. And of course, what is so ironic about this is, these aren't the words of one of King George's butt kissers. Benjamin Rush will be one of the American colonists who will do more than practically anybody else to disrupt the relationship that the king has with his subjects. And yet, even he's still powerfully connected to the idea of monarchy and the connection with Great Britain. Now, who is the monarch we're talking about here? So, yes, the British have a political system that works. They have parliament, which is a representative body, but you might remember that part of the reason why parliament becomes so powerful is because none of the kings of England up until recently have spoken very good English. Now, you can't say that about King George III. And yes, I'm talking about that George III, the George III that will eternally be associated with the American Revolutionary War and the collapse of the British Empire in North America. The King George who's always criticized as being tyrant, being crazy, being mad. To be honest, if you were a British subject during this time period, you would probably say that King George III is the most qualified member of the royal family in probably the last century. Why? Well, because he spoke English. All his predecessors, George I, George II, they all spoke German first and spent a lot of their reign in Germany focusing on German problems. Here's what we can say about George III. He wasn't the brightest crayon in the box, but with superlatives, there can only be one crayon that's called the brightest, right? So that's not necessarily like a huge criticism of George III. But, George III, quite apart from being considered a symbol of absolutism, thought of himself as a figure of the Enlightenment and responsible government. Like, it's Louis XIV and all of those spendthrifts in France who are tyrannical and who demand taxes and contributions from the public without representation. George III, if there's anything that people criticize George III for, is being frugal. The guy actually gave his kids an allowance, and he made them stick to it. He wouldn't pay for for sugar to sweeten tea at the royal palace, which, by the way, did not make him Dad of the Year, according to his kids. And also, to top it all off, he seemed to be legitimately taken with his wife. He kind of liked her and didn't have a mistress that he supported out of the public purse. So this is kind of amusing. In Buckingham Palace, and by the way, this is the time where Buckingham Palace becomes kind of like the official royal residence. At this point, it was more like one of many. But outside of Buckingham Palace, apparently King George III would grow his own food. And people sort of called him, in kind of a tongue-in-cheek way, Farmer George, because he would apparently go around town and strike up conversations with people about, how are your turnips doing? My turnips are not doing very well. I mean, apparently he wasn't a very good conversationalist, but still, the guy cared. The guy cared about being seen as a figure of responsibility. And this is not a merry monarch like Charles II or Louis XIV or Louis XV. This is somebody who is trying to represent those virtues of frugality, which, again, remember, for a Britain in the aftermath of the French and Indian War is very important, because if there's any point where you should be frugal, it's after that. But speaking of the Enlightenment, George III was apparently very interested in science, was the figure who starts the Royal Astronomical Society. I mean, this is, again, the guy's not a genius, but you don't have to be a genius to be a monarch. Instead, in his mind, and in the mind of many people at the time, George III was kind of a breath of fresh air. Now, what is, of course, also really bizarre about this time period is we have to explain something in a hurry. Again, Benjamin Rush felt an emotional connection with the British government, the crown, and his identity as a British subject in the British Empire. Again, Benjamin Rush was born in the American colonies, was raised in the American colonies. That American identity was important to him, but so too was it important that, that he be a British subject, right? And so the mystery that we have to explain is how in the 1760s and 1770s we have a society of British people, British colonists living in the colonies. How do they go from being British to being American? Um, and partially the answer is, an improbable series of circumstances that leads people to abandon their British identity. But of course, the other side to it is that many Americans don't abandon that identity. It takes a while for that British identity to subside because, again, that identity was still very, very powerful. So, if I were to ask you whether a breakup between Britain and the American colonies was inevitable, you guys would probably say no, based upon what we've just talked about. And anytime a historian asks you, is this inevitable? The answer is always no. But it's especially no in this case because, again, you have a British Empire where many of the founders themselves considered themselves to be proud citizens of their colonies, but also proud subjects of the British Empire. What changed? Well, the French and Indian War. Because remember, Britain ends that war bankrupt and then some. They buy their way to victory. And so the question is, how do you pay all that debt off? Enter Lord George Grenville, who has been described by historian Paul Johnson. I love this description of Grenville right here. A persnickety and self-righteous gentleman who had a gift for doing the wrong thing. Just got to love that, that shade and understatement. A gift for doing the wrong thing. So, George Grenville, like most of the British politicians and leaders we're going to be talking about, are really monomaniacally concerned with paying off debt and ignore all other consequences. And by the way, when debt gets bad enough, you hear a lot of the same stuff in the United States and beyond, right? I mean, debt is a very serious concern. If you don't take it seriously, it can lead to bankruptcy or hyperinflation. Neither of those two scenarios are all that good. So, what happens is that not only is Grenville and our politicians like Grenville concerned with paying off the debt, you also have additional expenses to take into account. At any given time, there's nearly 10,000 British troops stationed throughout the American colonies, sometimes even more than that. And so the question that the colonists had throughout this period is why? Again, the French are gone. We can take care of the Native Americans better than they can. They're just going to get themselves ambushed. So why is this force there? For the British, it's about policing the proclamation line, not an argument that would gain a lot of sympathy with the colonists. And it's also about protecting the colonies from, a hostile Native American insurrection. But again, that just seemed really suspicious. Now, from the British perspective, those troops are being stationed in the colonies to defend the colonists. It's not like London has to be defended on the frontiers of Massachusetts, right? So the British political establishment, including Grenville, sees upon the following observation. Well, the British people are taxed very heavily. And you know what? We can't really expect them to contribute much more in the way of tax revenue to pay off the debt. You know who's not being taxed? Oh, yeah, the American colonists. They're not being taxed. We don't directly tax them. They kind of live on the public dole. And guess what? Who benefited most from the French and Indian War? Oh, yeah, that's right, the American colonists, because the French are eliminated as a hostile threat. And again, the fact that King George established the proclamation line almost immediately after the war was kind of lost, a point that was lost to the British. So the George Grenville actually calls Americans the least taxed people on earth. And technically, he's kind of right. The average British subject was the most taxed subject in all of Europe. They were usually taxed over 26 times as much as what an American person would be taxed. Now, for some context, though, you have to remember how taxation worked in the British Empire, and also just in Britain historically. So remember that for taxation to be considered legitimate, taxation has to be accompanied by representation. And so we'll touch on this point a little bit more, but from the American perspective, they were taxed, but they were taxed by their local colonial legislatures. And so until, and only these legislatures had the legitimate right to tax the colonists. More on that later, by the way. So how does taxation work? Nowadays, what happens is most governments around the world rely on an income tax. In other words, the government taxes individuals directly based upon how much they earn. That's certainly not the only form of taxation, but it's the major form nowadays. But if you think about it, that's kind of impossible to know or to keep track of for governments or individuals. For one thing, the definition of money during this time period was fairly flexible, abstract, and also, modern day accounting practices are just now emerging. Even incredibly intelligent people like Thomas Jefferson, who, by the way, Jefferson kept like a ledger, keeping track of every single transaction he made throughout his life, and yet he still did not have an idea or a clue how much money he had at any given time. So you want to talk about income? You need standardized bookkeeping and reporting and recording to keep track of that. So for the British and for most governments during this time period, instead of taxing individuals, you would tax trade, imports, and exports. This is why that mercantilism point that we've kind of mentioned is so important, because mercantilism is about trade and stimulating trade. And so what the British would do historically and in this time period is they would tax certain goods or products, typically products that were shipped to Britain by the American colonies. And we should also point out that when we're looking at these taxes, there's some precedent here. In the 1650s, the British passed the Navigation Acts. In 1733, there's something called the Molasses Act. These are basically taxes on certain special items or commodities like sugar, for example. And they will also kind of regulate where American colonists could sell those products. So, in other words, it's nothing really new for the British to step in and pass those policies. But the thing is that every time the British taxed those policies, they were kind of laughed at. Because in order to collect that tax, you actually have to have people, human bodies, who will search ships for cargo that can be taxed, right? You need people to enforce that tax. And historically, the British governments have just realized that was more trouble than it was really worth. So at a certain point, if you have taxes that are unenforceable, you're just going to look kind of silly. Like the proclamation line. totally unenforceable. And the fact is that it would be violated all the time. The only thing it served to do is to make colonists angry. So if you think about the Proclamation Act as a trend as opposed to an exception, you're going to understand a lot of British policy during this time period. So the question is, how are you actually going to search ships for items that could be taxed? Well, to do that, you have to basically give the British Navy certain powers of law enforcement. And British ships were given what's called writs of assistance. This is basically like a super search warrant. So if you unfortunately run into a situation where you get pulled and a police officer asks to search your car, at the very least, there are certain restrictions to how far they can search in most situations. Writs of assistance basically give British ships the right to basically do whatever they want to search and seize suspected cargo that was suspected of being smuggled. Well, what if this British captain discovers smuggled cargo? What happens then? Well, issues on tax policy are really complicated. I mean, yes, there's this whole thing about having jury trials, but can you imagine smugglers being tried for tax evasion? Let's say that people who are sort of accused of trying to dodge taxes, sometimes they can be treated very sympathetically, especially in those colonies that are not, let's say, all that favorably disposed towards those taxes. So what do the British do? They decide to try all cases involving smuggling in what's called a court of vice admiralty. This is a court that is basically made to exclusively deal with issues involving smuggling. In maritime law. So this court is actually located in Halifax, Nova Scotia. So a little ways away from the American colonies. That's problem one. Problem two is kind of evoking memories of the Star Chambered Court. These are trials without jury trials. These are trials in which there's just a judge. So you can't Andrew Hamilton your way out of a bad situation by appealing directly to the jury. There's no jury to appeal to. There's just a judge. And by the way, how is this judge going to be paid? Glad you asked. The judge is going to be paid by taking possession of the property that was smuggled. So, I wonder how often smugglers were found guilty. By the way, most of the time, smugglers who were arrested and tried for violating some of these British tax laws, whether you're talking about the Sugar Act or beyond that, most of the time they were guilty. But it's the principle of the thing, right? There's no jury. The process seems really sketchy. And of course, you have a judge who's being paid with, let's say, the property that's being smuggled. So of course, they're going to find suspected smugglers guilty because otherwise they don't get paid. And if you're wondering, this is why smugglers, ergo pirates, were kind of figures of sympathy, actually, during the American Revolutionary War. Actually, piracy has kind of like this long checkered history in the American colonies. Of course, in our neck of the woods, we have Blackbeard, who basically, his I guess hunting grounds was kind of near Newbern, near the outer banks of North Carolina. So, and Blackbeard wasn't an incredibly charming person, by the way. Pirates and smugglers generally are not. And by the way, a lot of times, if you were a smuggler, you were also a pirate and vice versa. So, it's really with these writs of assistance and tax laws like the Sugar Act, also known as the American Revenue Act, that make smugglers figures of public sympathy. So John Hancock, who I'm sure you've heard of, because at the very least you know that John Hancock is another term we use to describe somebody's signature. He wasn't a politician. At least not by birth. He was a smuggler, and a very wealthy smuggler at that. But one of his ships was basically taken possession of by the British. It was the ship called the Liberty. Nice foreshadowing there, John. And eventually, the Liberty is transformed, becomes a British revenue cutter. In other words, this smuggled ship is, basically becomes a ship to enforce British tax policy. That certainly doesn't do the British any favors. Spoiler: what happens is that in 1769, I believe, it eventually that British revenue cutter eventually runs aground in the colony of Rhode Island, and a mob of angry Rhode Islanders rise up and burn the ship. I suppose if that's not like a good reason to avoid Rhode Island, nothing is. Like maybe the British were onto something there. But anyway, this is why John Hancock actually is president during, I think, both for the First and Second Continental Congresses, because he was again a figure of some sympathy. And this is, an example of just how these tax policies could backfire. Oh, and by the way, just as importantly, the other reason these tax policies were a terrible idea is because the Sugar Act required a large number of ships to actually enforce it. So the tax itself only raised about £30,000 in revenue. It was expected that the tax would raise anywhere from £73,000 to £100,000 in revenue. It was not successful there. But the British still made some profit, right? At least that's £30,000 that they didn't have. Well, you'd be wrong. This is a tax that actually cost the British money. Now, most taxes, like the whole idea is that the government is making money, right? Not losing money. Otherwise, it's just called, I don't know, charity. This is a tax that actually costs the British an enormous amount of money to enforce, because again, it required a large force of ships on standby to basically act as a policing force. And by the way, the Royal Navy, which was probably the best navy in the world then, and for a while after that, they were not happy basically becoming the equivalent of the British highway patrol, stopping suspected smugglers. So for every £1 of revenue that the British raised, it cost £4 in administrative costs, salaries, benefits, etc. So, in other words, for all the fuss, for all the anger, anxiety, and frustration, the British would have just been better off if they had done nothing. Eventually, the British kind of realized that this is a little silly, and they repeal the tax later on in 1766. Now, something else that happens is that in 1764, there is an act called the Currency Act, which prevents local colonial legislatures from issuing their own currency. Everything's got to be in British pounds. Again, really hard to enforce. But again, it kind of rankles, the feelings of colonial legislators because, for one, there had never been a lot of British currency, especially currency that was denominated in precious metals like gold and silver. There had never been a lot of that in the American colonies. That did not mean that the American colonies were poor. They were actually fairly wealthy where it mattered. So if you're looking at standards of living, if you're looking at the quantity and quality of goods and commodities that were being extracted and traded, the American colonies were pretty wealthy. They just didn't happen to have a lot of cash. But this was one of those things that kind of rankled, undermined the independence of a lot of these colonies. And speaking of getting people frustrated, you also have the Quartering Act. Now, again, this is a British policy, a British tax that makes sense on paper. And a lot of these tax policies kind of do. What happens is that the British government is just trying to find an effective yet fair way to tax the American colonies. And because, again, almost as a matter of conviction, they believe that colonials should pay their fair share in the cost of defending the British Empire. And remember, you had 10,000 British troops stationed in the colonies at any given point. And apparently that army cost £500,000 a year to maintain. And by the way, £500,000 in those days would have been the equivalent of millions and millions of dollars today. So it's not a small amount of money. So the British are trying to look for ways of reducing those costs. And so they decide to pass the Quartering Act. The Quartering Act basically makes American colonists responsible for the upkeep of the British Army in the New World. And that includes, by the way, situations like you, maybe adopting one of these guys and letting them crash on your couch basically for a while. I mean, so just think about this. You're like in Boston. And by the way, remember, Boston does not have exactly a great sort of relationship with the mother country. But, you wake up in the morning, you're going downstairs, and then you see the refrigerator is open because they totally had refrigerators in the 1700s. And you see like this British soldier in his jammies with a red coat draped over himself, and he's, drinking your milk, of course, right out of the carton, and going, "Oi, those leftovers, they were pretty rank, pretty terrible, that, but, thanks for that. All right, off to work." And it would go on like that. I mean, you get these policies that are, again, they're there to address a need, but the execution is just terrible. And also, like, joking aside, because again, they didn't have refrigerators in the 18th century, you also have some historical baggage you got to deal with. Because remember, in the Anglo-American experience, it's generally not acceptable to station professional soldiers in the homes of the ordinary of the population in general. I mean, for one, what if they're searching your stuff, right? That's problem one. But problem two is that the last instance in British history in which you had a large professional army that was charged with policing the population, that was those were the days of Oliver Cromwell and the British Commonwealth, where basically Britain becomes a military dictatorship. A lot of those British troops were stationed in northern colonies, and remember, those northern colonies, especially Massachusetts, they're already pretty paranoid about Great Britain on a good day, and so suddenly the idea that British soldiers are going to be stationed in the homes of ordinary people, that frightens some people. So we've talked a lot about some dumb tax policies that kind of make sense on paper, but then when you actually think about them in practice, they seem horribly stupid. Let's talk about the dumbest one of all. Let's talk about probably the one that you've heard something about already, the Stamp Act. And no, it's not a tax on stamp collecting. If that's the case, stamp collector extraordinaire Franklin Delano Roosevelt would be really disappointed. No, this is a tax on basically all documents. And I mean all documents. So, if you're talking about newspapers, if you're going to print this newspaper, there has to be a government stamp affixed to it. books, potentially, playing cards, because I guess that's a document, maybe. So basically anything that has printing on it is going to require an official tax. So there are a multitude of problems with this particular act. Let's talk about something first that's not unique to the Stamp Act, and that is this whole debate about representation. So, yes, it's been a thing since Runnymede and the Magna Carta in 1215 that if the British are going to pass taxes, that there should be some representation involved, right? That the people being taxed are being represented in government. So, that's something that basically everybody within the British Empire agrees on for the most part. The question, though, is what is representation? And this is the sticking point that comes up again and again in the lead up to the American Revolution. So, for the colonies, for the colonial population, representation meant that the body that was passing these taxes, in this case the British Parliament, that it would actually have real representatives from the areas being taxed. So, for example, if this tax is going to apply to the people of Massachusetts, that means that technically there should be an official representative from the colony of Massachusetts in the British Parliament. As you might imagine, that's not the way things worked, because in fact what happened is that the British Parliament only spoke for those districts and constituencies in Great Britain, right? Just like, by the way, Puerto Rico today is considered an overseas territory. It has no representation in Congress necessarily. So there's that same kind of basic argument as to what representation is. And the British position in the 1760s, and actually the American position today in the 2020s, is that it's okay. We're still a representative government. We just represent everybody through Parliament. So, in other words, Parliament represents all subjects of the British Empire, no matter who's actually in Parliament. So basically, it's the idea that, if you are a member of Parliament from Birmingham, or Oxfordshire. Well, of course, you can put yourself in the shoes of an American colonist and kind of represent their views just as you can the views of your constituents. So it is a very, in some respects, it's an abstract debate, but it wouldn't be abstract to people during that time period. They're like, are you really saying that somebody half a world away knows how I live, what I go through? And if you're Great Britain, the answer is yes. Yes, they do. Now, that's kind of point one for the colonies, I suppose, but the British would probably reply, well, yeah, but are you guys really going to enact taxes that will help pay down the debt? Well, sure we would. Really? Are you really going to do that? Well, of course. We were totally getting around to that. It's never happened before. All the tax revenue collected by colonial legislatures have historically remained in the colonies. So we have an impasse. And this is where the phrase taxation without representation, or no taxation without representation, comes from. James Otis, a name you'll hear quite a lot of now and in the near future, says, quote, taxation without representation is tyranny. And what's kind of interesting is that this tax was criticized for, let's say that the criticism wasn't that this is a tax imposed by a foreign power. I mean, again, this is a subject about British law by British people. And so the perspective of the American colonies is that this is an example of the British not practicing what they preach, of the British ignoring their own constitutional and legal precedents. So there's a James Otis goes on and says, the colonists are entitled to as ample rights, liberties, and privileges as the subjects of the mother country are, and in some respects to more. So, in other words, he's not like, objecting to British law. He's saying that the Stamp Act violates British law, which is a recurring theme. The founders, as a general rule, tended to be very pro-British up to a point. And their criticism is not that the British are British. It's that the British aren't acting British enough, to a certain extent. And you have lines from newspapers like the New Yorker during this time period that says the single stroke, being the Stamp Act, has lost Great Britain the affection of her colonies. So melodramatic language, but it probably gets at the mood felt by some people. And so let's talk a little bit about why this tax was dumb, because that's kind of the philosophical debate. Let's talk about how the tax worked in practice. So who are going to be the most aggrieved by the Stamp Act? Well, people like writers and authors and lawyers and politicians. In other words, you are taxing the persuasive class. These are individuals that are sort of paid to make arguments, to be convincing, right? So think about this. If you're a lawyer and suddenly you basically get taxed because you work in a very paper-intensive business, well, suddenly every lawyer in the American colonies is going to stand up and object to the Stamp Act at the very least. And that's something we also have to kind of keep in mind. Speaking of, when you're sourcing documents, the fact that the Stamp Act was a tax on, let's say, the writing class, the intelligentsia, means that you are going to see a heavy bias in the sources against the Stamp Act. Because if you are writing stuff down, odds are that you're literate, and odds are that you're more than likely going to work in a profession that requires you to pay this tax. So when you look at the sources, you're going to see a lot of animus against the Stamp Act. So if you need to, go ahead and pause this slide right here and take down the definition of virtual representation. Again, if you were to ask the colonists, to the extent that they were aware of the political argument involved, they wouldn't say that they objected to all taxes, at least in theory. Some probably really did object to any and all taxes. But at least in theory, what they would say is that taxes are appropriate if they come from your real representatives. And so to the colonists, that's what colonial legislatures are for. Now, another important point here is that these colonial legislatures are not really considered legitimate by the British government. Remember that the British have kind of tolerated these colonial legislatures and have been willing to work with them to legitimize taxes levied in the colonies at the local level to support the salaries of royal governors, etc. But nobody has really there's never really been an instance where you have kind of a dispute, as it were, between colonial legislatures and the British Parliament. And when push comes to shove, the perspective of the Crown is always going to be, well, these colonial legislatures, they're not really legal entities anyway. So many of these colonial legislatures are kind of nervous about their position in this environment. What is their job if the British Parliament can kind of pass taxes without going through them or using them? And again, it's not as if the British haven't taxed the colonies before, but at the same time, the British have never been really serious about it, or as serious about it as they are during this time period. So what happens is that the Virginia House of Burgesses issues what is called the Virginia Resolves or the Staff Act Resolves. And to give you guys the Cliff Notes version, this essentially affirms the fact that Virginians are citizens of the British Empire. And being citizens of the British Empire, they have the same rights and privileges that they would have in England. Again, you're not seeing people desirous to abandon their British identity yet. But they also point out that self-taxation, in other words, taxation through representation, is one of those rights. Virginians have always taxed themselves, and that's kind of why the House of Burgesses was created in the first place. Now, here is what kind of seems almost seditious. The Virginia Resolves also stipulates that any tax that came from outside of Virginia was by definition illegitimate. Now, the reason why this is so over the top is that in the British political system, Parliament is considered the supreme law of the land. There's no real separation of powers in the British political system. Yes, you have a monarchy. Yes, you have a legislature and a judicial system. But really, it's Parliament who controls all. Parliament sets how much money the king can spend. And Parliament can also pass legislation over the heads and over the rulings of British judges, no matter how powerful they are. So for a colonial legislature, well, if even King George has to think twice about going head-to-head with Parliament, what about this piddly little House of Burgesses, which isn't even, at least in theory, politically legitimate in the first place? It seemed almost farcical to a certain extent. So the Virginia the Virginia Resolves was issued, and it really throws a gauntlet down. And what's also interesting is this is where Patrick Henry, who you guys have probably heard of before, gets his start and really claim to fame. You probably remember Patrick Henry for one quote, and that is the "Give me liberty or give me death" thing. And you probably think that the context is, well, he's saying that, during the Second Continental Congress when the Declaration of Independence is signed, right? Or he's saying it in some other, major moment in American history. And no, in fact, he is saying this during the debates on the Virginia Resolves. And apparently when he does this, just reading the quote, you lose something in the process. Apparently he would say, "Give me liberty or give me death." And then he would pause for a second and, kind of have an imaginary dagger in his hand. And then after pausing for a minute, he would plunge it into his heart. And I don't know, I guess he would pretend to die or something. So it was really over-the-top stuff. But again, people ate that up. Now, it's also interesting to remember that this is coming from Virginia. Virginia is mommy's favorite. Massachusetts, they're the kid that ran away when they were 15 and, managed to sort of make it. They've sort of provided for themselves, but things have always been kind of awkward over Thanksgiving. Whenever they come home, whenever Massachusetts looks over at mom, they just kind of exchange a lot of passive-aggressive commentary on the food. So the relationship between mom, Great Britain, and Massachusetts has never been great. But Virginia, they're the colony just like mom, They're kind of a chip off the old block, right? And so Great Britain has kind of told the other colonies, Massachusetts, why can't you be like your sister? Your sister got the best grades, went to the right schools. They're just like me. Why can't you be just like her? And for Virginia to signal some displeasure was pretty significant, actually. So all of these colonial legislatures issue protests, but remember, the British don't have to listen to them anyway. They probably should, but remember, they have no legal force. So, what certain colonists, canny colonists, realize is that these taxes are only as effective to the extent to which they can be enforced. Remember that the Sugar Act was practically unenforceable. It just cost too much money. So the Stamp Act was only enforceable because you had you basically had citizens who stood ready to basically affix the stamp to royal documents and collect taxes. And so you have, like, quite literally, stamp tax collectors. And so you have, leaders of organizations like the Sons of Liberty, leaders like Sam Adams, not this Sam Adams, but this Sam Adams, realize that public confrontation of some of these stamp tax collectors could be very, very effective. And so what happens is that the Sons of Liberty, okay, theoretically they are, and this is a term that has become political recently. The Sons of Liberty are peaceful protesters, right? They're simply petitioning against injustices perpetrated by Parliament. On the other hand, they certainly didn't mind using tactics that we would maybe classify as being a little extreme to get their point across, including demolishing statues of the king, as you can kind of see right here, but also intimidating individuals who were supposed to collect this tax. And there's one I want to talk about, a guy by the name of Andrew Oliver. So Andrew Oliver was a person who was supposed to collect stamp tax revenue. Now, the thing is that the tax isn't really supposed to come into force until 1765. So when the question is 1766, I think. So the question is, when 1766 rolls around, how many tax collectors are actually going to enforce this tax? Well, Andrew Oliver was riding to work one day. He worked in Boston. And in the distance, Andrew Oliver sees something near a tree. He goes closer, and then when he gets reasonably close, he notices that the object looks kind of familiar. He realizes that it is his own effigy. And by the way, that effigy has been hanged. So, Andrew Oliver promptly calls in sick for practically the rest of his life and decides against enforcing the Stamp Act. And many other stamp tax collectors follow suit. Many of them, by the way, could be publicly tarred and feathered, just in general intimidated. So, in other words, it was not an easy job. And what also happens is that in some of these, a lot of British royalists, British loyalists, I guess you could say, realize that this is a very short-sighted tax. Governor Thomas Hutchinson of Massachusetts writes to Parliament in London that, quote, it cannot be good to tax the Americans. You will lose more than you gain. Which is true. But, the irony is for poor Thomas Hutchinson is that eventually at one of these demonstrations against the Stamp Act, an angry mob forms, and this angry mob actually travels to Governor Hutchinson's house and burns it to the ground. Now, one of the things that is kind of interesting about the American Revolution is it really a revolution? Because with revolutions, you usually see a lot of social upheaval. violence, protests, that kind of thing. And compared to other revolutions, like the French Revolution, you don't see a lot of that. But you do see glimpses of it during the 1760s and early 1770s, where you do have a few instances of mob violence, admittedly organized by a fairly small group of individuals. A group that at first is called the Loyal Nine, Nine, and then eventually they become the Sons of Liberty. And this group kind of sticks around for a while. And again, they're mostly middle class to lower middle class, artisan, tradesmen, just merchants who are most affected by the British Stamp Act. Now, if the Sons of Liberty were trying to win hearts and minds, they certainly had a funny way of showing it, forming angry mobs and intimidating people, burning down the house of a royal governor, stuff that is not going to inherently elicit a lot of sympathy. Uh, but you also see some other ways of undermining these British policies that don't so much depend upon hearts and minds, but on pocketbooks. So many colonial legislatures adopt non-importation agreements where they agree not to import British goods. And it's also important to remember that Britain is going through the early stages of its industrial revolution, which enabled it to sell goods on the cheap, especially if we're talking about clothing. So these non-importation agreements tried to undermine the British advantage in exporting cheap goods. And what actually happened is these non-importation agreements were very effective. British imports fell by almost 40% in the American colonies. And increasingly, the American colonies weren't just seen as mines and fields that you could basically extract resources out of. The American colonies were increasingly seen as a marketplace because, again, you have almost 2.5 million people in the colonies by the American Revolution. And it's not like there are 2.5 million people who are poor. They're generally pretty middle class and have some disposable income. So these non-importation agreements were supported by groups like the Daughters of Liberty, who in some respects are less famous but arguably more effective than their male counterparts. Because the Daughters of Liberty, what they would do is they would actually hold, these kind of impromptu gatherings in which they would get together and weave cloth together to create clothing to kind of replace clothes that were lost because of these bans on British imports. So this sort of economic confrontation against the British was very effective because remember, why are the British passing these taxes in the first place? Is it because they feel like it? No, it's because they're trying to raise money. And so if you're losing money rather than making money, why are you trying to enforce this tax policy in the first place? So also what happens is that 9 colonial assemblies come together in the Stamp Act Congress, and they decide to petition the king in Parliament directly in what's called the Declaration of Rights and Grievances. And this is, something that we kind of see with the Virginia Resolves. Again, the restatement that the Stamp Act is unconstitutional. There should be no taxation without representation. But you also see other complaints bubble to the surface. The fact that admiralty courts were abusive and that there should always be a right to a jury trial. So what we're kind of seeing is that it becomes less about the Stamp Act and more about long-standing differences with Great Britain to a certain extent. So because of all of this trouble, what ultimately happens is that when November 1st, 1765 rolls around, this is, by the way, the day that the Stamp Act is supposed to be enforced. I was a little bit wrong on that day, by the way. Apparently, there is no revenue collected in tax. The Stamp Act, just like the Sugar Act, just like the Proclamation Line of 1763, they're ultimately unenforceable. And so the British sort of quietly repeal the Stamp Act because it was just kind of humiliating. And the Sons of Liberty spread beyond Massachusetts to the other colonies. So that's a big win for the American colonies, right? They stood up to the mother country and they won, kind of. Because there are very different lessons learned from the Stamp Act and the reaction to it. What radicals learn, individuals who sometimes variously called themselves radicals, Whigs, patriots, what they learned is that when you stand up to the British and show that you're willing to use maybe a little bit of intimidation if necessary, the British ultimately will blink. This was kind of a test of resolve, and the colonies won. However, what the British, or what maybe the colonists didn't notice, is the passage of the Declaratory Act in 1766. And I'm going to paraphrase kind of the key points of the Declaratory Act. You notice, by the way, there are lots of parliamentary acts that we kind of have to describe here. But basically, the act says this: yes, we repealed the Stamp Act. We can do that. We're Parliament. We can do what we want. That is the point. We can do what we want. We speak for the entirety of the British Empire, and no piddly little colonial legislature is going to tell us otherwise. So, when we pass taxes that are enforceable by law. What you get a sense of is that the Declaratory Act is a sign that Britain is losing patience. They've tried a variety of taxes, and those ungrateful colonials are just not happy with any tax that they pass. And didn't you know, we saved them in the last war, and this is how they show their gratitude. We'll let this go. But there will come a point in which we won't compromise. And this is that point I mentioned earlier in the beginning of the year, that sometimes you have to be terrified of when rational people get angry. Because rational people know they're rational, and sometimes when you push rational people to a certain point, they explode. And they explode because their assumption is you're just being a terrible person because you're pushing me around. I don't deserve this. The British have been trying to raise revenue, and they've tried everything, and they are fed up. Next time, you will see how the British Empire will explode in war. Till then.